This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means? It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop Black Friday week deals now.
Fever, cough, congestion. When the symptoms keep coming, but you've got to keep going, you can rely on Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One. Just one dose of Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One relieves up to 9 cold and flu symptoms, helping you get on with your day. Need cold and flu relief? Get Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One and Done Relief. It's comeback season. Use as directed.
On the morning of June 12th, 1995, the Misang Apartments, Building 5, was full of its usual activity, but a scent lingered in the air. Neighbors began to notice a smoky smell emanating throughout the halls. As the security guard on the ground floor walked the perimeter of the building, he noticed a thin, white smoke seeping from a window on a high floor. The smoke dispersed into the wind quickly, so he didn't think that this was a fire, but rather someone fumigating their apartment with some kind of indoor fogger for cockroaches. It was inconsiderate to do this without notifying your neighbors or the building manager. He checked his watch, 8:10 a.m. When he returned to the security office 10 minutes later, he called over the intercom to the apartment he believed it to be. He asked the woman who answered if she was fumigating. She said no, but she had smelled smoke in the hallway. She wondered if people were smoking indoors. Moments later, a resident from the 7th floor came down to the security office and told him, "There's a lot of smoke in the hallway." The security man began to search the floors to find the source of the smoke. After 20 minutes of searching, he found what he believed to be the door that it was coming from. He discovered smoke was pouring out from under the door of apartment 708, the home of Mr. Do-haeng and Mrs. Choi Soo-hee and their 2-year-old daughter, Hwa-young. The smoke was still quite clear and thin, so he didn't call the fire department. Rather, he started knocking. After getting no answer, he returned to his security office and called the apartment over the intercom. There was again no answer, so rather than calling the fire department, he decided to quickly smoke a cigarette, grab a hammer, and force his way into the apartment. I would think that a security office would have a master key for the apartments, but in this instance, they didn't. At the Misang Apartments, they had their doors facing outwards, with a gated balcony wrapping around the building in like a shared outdoor hallway. Each apartment had a window that also faced outside to this shared walkway. Similar to a motel-style balcony, he took the hammer and broke through the front window, causing a lot more smoke to start billowing out. Seeing now that the smoke inside the apartment was a dark black, covering everything with a thick soot, he grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and began to spray it inside the apartment. Either bravely or stupidly, he began to walk through the apartment but couldn't locate the source of the fire. He ran downstairs and called the fire department at this point. It had been over an hour since he first saw smoke coming from the apartment. If this had been a fire out of control, by this point it would have consumed more than just one apartment. The fire department arrived quickly at 9:28 a.m., about 20 minutes later. After securing the scene by spraying the building and inside of the apartment and venting the smoke out, they noticed that there was very little damage to the interior. The smoke had indeed left a grime over the apartment, but there was very minimal burn damage to the home. The source of the fire was found in the home's bedroom dresser. Some clothes had been ignited, burned, but contained inside of the closed wardrobe doors. As the fire burned, it died out from a lack of oxygen and just began to smolder, which caused a lot of smoke that filled the home over time. At first, they believed the home to be empty, a victimless fire. until at 9:40 a.m., one of the emergency responders opened the bathroom door. Soot built up at the foot of the door, but for the most part, the room was untouched by the black dust, except for the bathtub, which was filled to the top with water. The water was dark from the settling residue on the surface. Even dark, the firefighter was able to see that there was someone in the water, laying face down, with a pair of small feet sticking out of the side of the tub, belonging to a child. Choi Soo-hee and her daughter, Hwa-young, were laying dead in their own bath. Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. You can support Korean True Crime on Patreon today. Lastly, join us on Discord for movie nights of films based off of real crimes. Link is in the description. Warning. Today's episode contains some graphic description of the murder of a woman and her young daughter. Listener discretion is advised. Choi Soo-hee and her daughter Hwa-young were pulled from the tub following the police's arrival and collection of photographic evidence. I say this rarely in my episodes, but the police followed protocol by collecting every piece of information they could from this crime scene. The bath water temperature was recorded as they knew it would be necessary in determining the time of death. The water was lukewarm when they arrived. Soo-hee was laying in the bath face down. A hand towel and diaper were thrown on the back of her head. She was topless, with her underwear pulled down to just above her knees. Her daughter, Hwa-young, was in her red striped sleeping dress and a diaper. Her body was laying diagonally across her mother. They were pulled from the water and examined. The cause of death from first examination appeared to be strangulation, as both Soo-hee and Hwa-young had red ligature marks across their necks that is indicative of a rope or string being used to strangle. Soo-hee's body had already started the first stages of rigor mortis, which was presumed to be because of the hot initial temperature of the water. Soo-hee's face had a red mark from being struck in the face, and her eyes were bloodshot. They also noted that she still was wearing her contacts. They measured the width of the mark on her neck and discovered that the curtains in the bedroom had a cord missing from them that had been cut with scissors or a knife, something sharp. This cord would match the 0.2 centimeters in diameter mark on her neck. On her left hand, there was also blood under her fingernails. However, when they collected this and tested it, there were no traces of DNA. The way that her body was found immediately indicated that there was an attempt to sexually assault her. So an examination was conducted to determine if she had been raped. There was no evidence of intercourse or penetration, leading the investigators to believe that her body was staged to look like a sexual assault. There was also the possibility that the assailant was unable to perform. The scrapes and bruises on her arm and face showed that she had fought hard against her attacker, so hopefully they were going to find someone that had marks of this encounter. Her daughter Hwa-young had a similar strangulation mark that her mom did, but with a much, much thinner rope or string, almost like a fishing wire was used. Neither of the strings or ropes were found at the crime scene. The forensic team finished their on-scene examination and sent the bodies into the morgue. In the meantime, the fire marshal and the police continued to search the apartment. The apartment had no signs of forced entry beyond the window that the security guard had broken. The window was indeed locked when the security guard got there, as well as the front door, which had just a simple key entry. If you are thinking to yourself right now, wait, didn't I hear this exact story last episode? Am I listening to that episode again? Then you would be right and wrong. This case is very similar to the previous episode, The Ambidextrous Family Annihilator, but I'm choosing to tell these stories back to back because of how similar and dramatic they both are. I could not stop reading the court documents for this case because it felt like history had repeated itself in the previous episode. And if you've learned anything, it's that the first suspect is always the spouse. Soo-hee's husband was Dr. Do-haeng, a surgeon who was opening up his very own private surgical clinic that day. While his family was being zipped up into body bags and the police were taking evidence out of his home, he was shaking hands with investors and greeting patients. That might sound a little cold of me to say, but this case isn't called the Korean OJ Simpson for no reason. Because the husband was at work, the police investigated to see if this was a home invasion or a robbery. The police immediately knew that this was not a robbery because there was cash and jewelry and valuables inside the apartment that were untouched. Nothing in the home appeared to be upturned or moved around in a way that looked like a robbery. This was clearly someone who came into the home with the intent to murder the woman and her child, then tried to cover up their tracks by setting fire to the apartment. But they might not have known that closing the wardrobe doors would limit the oxygen inside and essentially kill the flames of the fire. It's likely that they intended for the apartment to burn down with all of the evidence. Before we get into the whereabouts of Do-haeng, let's go back and learn a little bit about how Do-haeng and Soo-hee got married. Do-haeng was a very introverted and quiet man who worked as a surgeon at Dongdaemun Hospital in Seoul. One day, one of his nurses offered to introduce him to her single sister. Her sister was a second-year dental student at Yonsei University's College of Dentistry, which is pretty impressive. This was Choi Soo-hee. When the two met, they immediately hit it off and started dating. They started dating in 1988 and got married in November 1989. His parents really did not support him getting married to a dental student because they believed that this would cause a lot of financial strain on him when he needed to focus on his career. Because she was just a student, she wasn't making money, and they were worried that he would be supporting her. He had just left his residency, so it wasn't like he was in a great financial situation yet. But Soo-hee continued her schooling and eventually graduated in 1991. She began working at a public dentistry hospital for a little bit over a year until she decided she wanted to open her own dental clinic called Yeonsa Dental Clinic. This is pretty ambitious considering she was a new dentist. In 1992, 3 years into their marriage, Do-haeng had to enlist for his mandatory military service, which he chose to do as a military surgeon. While he was enlisted in the military, he had a death in his family that put a lot of strain on his mental well-being. It got so bad that it started to affect his marriage as well. He was really unhappy that he was taking care of all of their living expenses and that his wife was spending a ton of money. Sure, she was working as a dentist and now had her own clinic, but they were still in the red. To open her own clinic, she had taken out a considerable amount of loans. Because she was just a new dentist, she didn't have a ton of money. She took out hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans from banks using their apartment as collateral, as well as using all of her husband's savings. Do-haeng would vent to his friends that he was really unhappy in his marriage and that he harbored a lot of negative feelings towards her. I don't blame him for resenting her for using all of their savings. He really tried to suppress these feelings to have a trouble-free marriage, but ultimately he described his relationship with his wife as submissive. It was no longer a partnership. It was just whatever his wife wanted, because she wasn't going to ask him first before she made huge life-changing decisions. Now, we're not trying to paint her as the bad person, but this is also corroborated by her own family. She had a little bit of a selfish side. While Soo-hee was spending all of their money to open up her dental clinic, she had hired an interior designer named Jun Woo-gil in 1992. After he completed the job in May of that year, Soo-hee asked him to go to lunch with her and some of her friends. She seemed to really like his company and they got along well. Her husband knew that she was friendly with the interior designer, but he didn't know the extent of how their friendship would progress. As time passed, they started spending a lot more time together, and he even visited her at the dental clinic until 2 or 3 in the morning. Everyone at the clinic knew that the two were having an affair, but they were not going to risk their jobs just to tell Do-haeng, so they kept quiet. By November 1992, Soo-hee and Ugil were meeting at motels, and in February 1993, they were parking near construction sites just to have sex. Not only were they having an affair, but Soo-hee was kind of his sugar mama. She was sending him money to buy cell phones, to buy clothes, buy nice things, but also investing in his sister's nightclub. This money was a loan, however, and she set out a strict repayment plan for him. At this point in the relationship, they were getting really serious. But then, Ugil's company started to lose business, and he started missing the repayment deadlines, which was completely unacceptable for her. Soo-hee started to act coldly towards him and started to just ignore his calls entirely. She demanded he pay off the money immediately. Then, Soo-hee finds out that she's pregnant, and she has Hwa-young later in 1993. This was the conclusion of her affair. After she had her daughter, she demanded that he pay back all of the money that he owed her, and she cut off the relationship entirely. He would sometimes call the dental clinic like once or twice a month, but she often just ignored his calls. Things were going fine. He was okay with the breakup. He moved on until he started calling the dental clinic a few months prior to the murders. He had called her at work a few times when he found out that her husband was opening his own private clinic. His business was still not doing the best, so he wanted to know if he could be the interior designer. She refused because, according to the prosecution, at this point, her husband had already accused her of having an affair. She wasn't going to risk any further contact with him and ruin the life that she wanted. The police discovered the affair rather quickly and investigated where Ugil was the night of the murder. It turned out that he had moved on. He had a new lover, and he actually had an alibi for that night. That wasn't the only strange thing that was happening months prior, though. The month prior to this incident, in May of 1995, Soo-hee's dental clinic started receiving phone calls where someone was calling from a blocked number, breathing into the phone, and then hanging up. The number was always hidden, so she had no clue who was calling. Oftentimes, it was the dental assistants or the receptionist who answered the phone. They didn't know what the purpose of these calls were because the person on the phone never said anything, and it didn't seem like they were targeting a specific person at the office. The calls had a very specific pattern, though. The calls always came after 2 p.m., and then after a week or so, Soo-hee realized that they were calling for her, because she started receiving these calls at her house. She was paranoid that her husband was trying to catch her with someone. Her husband had previously accused her of cheating on him because she was staying late at the clinic, and to be honest, she wasn't hiding her affair very well. She thought maybe her husband was trying to catch her slip up and have her lover answering the phone or hear men talking in the background of the call. Based off this belief that she had shared with her dental hygienist, I assumed that the calls probably only happened when her husband wasn't there. So maybe it actually was him. However, on May 27th, 1995, when the couple was having people over at their apartment, they got 4 to 5 of these calls after 8 p.m. The mystery caller kept calling until Do-haeng answered the phone, and then they just stopped. They didn't try again. They would continue to get these calls randomly throughout the day until just a few days before the murders. The police were not able to track whose phone number it was. Unrelated to the calls, but at that party, one of the friends who attended said that Do-haeng was acting really strangely. He was being really mean to his daughter. He had had a little bit too much to drink and had told every one of the guests that he thought his daughter didn't resemble him at all. He kept saying, "Hwa-young only looks like Soo-hee. Isn't it strange?" It seemed like he was insinuating that his daughter wasn't his. I'll clarify now that after their passing, a paternity test was done, and Hwa-young was Do-haeng's daughter. On June 11th, the day before the discovery of the arson and murders, Soo-hee's mother had come to visit and brought Soo-hee's niece with her. Her mother took care of all of the siblings' kids when they went to work. Soo-hee's mom and the niece slept over, and the next day around noon, she drove them back to her parents' house. She took Hwa-young out shopping and then came home and took her nightly shower at 7 p.m. Closer to 8 p.m., her mother called just to make sure that she got home safely and to ask her about her day. She talked with her family often, like daily. When she was talking to her mom on the phone, she mentioned that she was really hungry, but she was too busy taking care of Hwa-young to make dinner herself. She asked her mom if she could make some seaweed soup and bring it over because her husband wasn't home yet. Do-haeng came home around 30 minutes later, so when Soo-hee's mother called back at 9 p.m., this time Do-haeng answered, and he told her that they had already eaten and she didn't need to come over anymore. Her mother assumed that she had just eaten something else and everything was fine. At 9:30, Soo-hee spoke on the phone with her sister to talk about Do-haeng's clinic's grand opening, which was happening the next day. He was supposed to actually have his grand opening on the 17th, with them having a grand opening walkthrough party on the 16th. But he decided to rush the opening of the clinic and moved it up to the 12th. Because he had moved the date up, he actually had only hired 2 nurses and still needed more staff as well as an office manager. He wasn't really prepared to open the clinic yet. Soo-hee had the idea that he should hire her older sister that introduced them. She was working as a nurse and she could be his office manager. But he thought this was a terrible idea and refused to hire her because she was making more at her current job than he was going to be able to offer her as a salary. This started a huge argument between Soo-hee and Do-haeng. Soo-hee was very insistent that he hire family first and take care of family first. But he knew what he could and couldn't afford, and he couldn't afford to pay her what she was worth. He was trying to balance paying off Soo-hee's debts and the risk of opening his own clinic without sending his family into bankruptcy. Ironically, Soo-hee's older sister also agreed with Do-haeng, saying that it probably wasn't a great idea for family members to work together. Her sister just heard the couple have a loud argument while still on the phone with her. She knew that their marriage was very rocky. The last thing she probably wanted was to work with her sister's husband that her sister was probably going to get divorced from in the future. After this phone call ended, that is the last anyone heard from Soo-hee. She was supposed to drop off Hwa-young on her way to work at 8:10 a.m., but she never showed up. The police had their work cut out for them. They needed to determine what the time of death was to figure out if Do-haeng had been home at the time of the murders. An autopsy was conducted at 11:30 a.m. on the 12th after the bodies were sent to the morgue. Soo-hee had bilateral lividity centered on her right thigh. This is the bruising that appears when blood begins to pool in the part of your body closest to the ground. According to the medical examiner, after a person dies within 10 to 30 minutes, the body begins to show signs of change. The first large change is corneal clouding or milkiness in the eyes. Then the skin turns pale. This is usually the first sign a person notices when they see a dead body. It's very unnatural looking paleness. Livor mortis begins 30 minutes to a few hours. That's the blood pooling under the body as it stops circulating. Then rigor mortis begins an hour to 6 hours after a person's death. This is the stiffness of the muscles and joints in the body. It's believed Soo-hee's body experienced early rigor mortis because of the hot temperature of the water. All of this occurs while a person's body temperature decreases over time. Because both of the victims' bodies were placed into hot water, it was going to be more difficult to determine their time of death from their body temperature. As in most autopsies, the contents of her stomach were also examined. In her stomach, they found 350 grams of undigested rice and seaweed. They had found remnants of seaweed soup from dinner the evening before on the 11th. Do-haeng claimed that Soo-hee had eaten bean sprout soup in the morning when he left, but there was no evidence of that in her stomach. It was unlikely she had eaten breakfast. Based off the digestion of the food in her stomach, her time of death was likely between 11:30 p.m. on the 11th and 4 a.m. on the 12th. This gave the police a time frame that pretty much included only when Do-haeng was home. However, they needed to examine a lot more before they could determine the exact time of death. In this case, the time of death determination was examined, re-examined, retested, contested so often in court that this case was just a jumble. For the police to prove that beyond a doubt Do-haeng killed his wife, the only way to prove that was to determine what time she died. The public started following this case really closely because it seemed like an open and shut case, that the police knew the husband killed his family. But it was very difficult to actually prove that without any evidence that he was the one who did it. That's just one of the reasons why this ended up being called the Korean OJ Simpson case. Now, I am not going to talk about what happened in the OJ Simpson trial, so if you don't know what happened and you don't really understand the comparison, then I suggest you go and find a different podcast to listen to that about, because that trial is also equally as interesting. But essentially, it boils down to there just not being enough hard evidence in a case. The initial time of death was given a margin of error from 11:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. They specifically stated that it was really unlikely that the victims were alive after 7 a.m. Hwa-young's time of death was also determined to be about 30 minutes to an hour after her mother's. The murderer had killed Soo-hee and then waited in the apartment for at least a half hour before deciding to kill Hwa-young. Estimating their time of death had a very wide range of errors, especially in 1985. The timing and degree of post-mortem bruising can vary from person to person. And the bruising found on her leg that was initially believed to be from the blood pooling under her skin was actually found to be from the pressure of her underwear on her thigh. Because there was so much difficulty determining their times of death at this time, that is why it was so highly contested in the trial. The police looked towards what Soo-hee's daily routine was for help in understanding maybe what time she had done certain things. And Soo-hee's mother was really helpful in determining what the times she did things were, because she spent a lot of time with her daughter. She was often over at their house. She often helped cook dinner for them, so she knew her daughter's routine quite well. Soo-hee liked to go to bed very late at night and wake up every morning at 7 a.m., even on the weekends. She had an alarm set. She hated showering in the morning, so she always showered at night. She would keep her contact lenses in until she showered, and then she would wear her glasses until she did her makeup in the morning, when she would put the contact lenses back in. Soo-hee was found still wearing her contact lenses. This led them to believe that she likely was killed before she went to sleep. The shower did not appear to have been used the night before because there was no residue of water on the walls, which is something the police noted when doing another investigation of the apartment. Soo-hee's mom contradicted a lot of what Do-haeng testified happened that night before in the morning of. Let's compare his testimony of what happened to what Soo-hee's mom said her typical routine is. Do-haeng said that around 9 p.m. on the 11th, he finished dinner with his wife, and then at 9:30, his wife was talking to her sister on the phone. Soo-hee was cutting watermelon for all of the family to eat. This was confirmed because watermelon rinds were found in the trash bag he threw away the morning of the 12th. Soo-hee had been on the phone with her sister for a long while talking about his business. He omits the information about their argument, though, which the sister did provide. That's when he said he decided to get ready for the next day while his wife washed the dishes in the dishwasher. Soo-hee's mom said that she was quite particular about the dishes. She liked to hand wash them first, and then she would put them through the dishwasher. However, when the police opened the dishwasher, they found that there were no dishes inside. The dishes were soaking in the sink from the night before. Some of the dishes were even drying on the counter after being only hand washed. Do-haeng said that at 10 p.m., his wife had given their daughter a bottle of milk and then put her to bed. This bottle that was used was drying on the counter. Soo-hee always hand washed the bottles and then put them in the dishwasher because she never trusted the germs to be actually gone. Who did the dishes that evening was a huge part of the trial because they were trying to figure out, was Soo-hee alive in the morning? After giving their daughter a bottle of milk, they put Hwa-young to bed. They all went to bed together, but at 5 a.m., Soo-hee woke up to breastfeed Hwa-young and then went back to bed. Do-haeng says he woke up at around 6 a.m. to take a shower and get ready for the day. Then, his wife woke up at 6:20 a.m. and said she was going to take a shower. He said she was wearing a white sleeping shirt, but then later changed it to say she was wearing a sleeping gown. He seemed to change his story after seeing crime scene photos and seeing a sleeping gown laying on the bedroom floor. Her mother mentioned again that her alarm went off at 7 a.m. every morning, which was true. Her alarm was set for 7 a.m. And the shower had not been used that morning as well. She still had her contact lenses in. He said he went out to the kitchen to eat breakfast alone, and in the meantime, she was showering. When he was done eating, he started to do the dishes, but his wife told him not to because she was going to eat some bean sprout soup as well. He said she was eating breakfast at 7 a.m. when he left and went to work. This is where Soo-hee's mother's testimony on her daughter's habits is so important. Soo-hee's mom and siblings all told the police that Soo-hee never ate breakfast. And he would know this too. She always drank an herbal medicine pouch each morning and every night because these herbal medicine pouches were supposed to be good for her fertility, and she really wanted to have another child. They did find a medicine pouch in the microwave when searching the apartment for evidence. They believe that this pouch was left there from the night before. Everyone who knew Soo-hee said that she was really strict about her diet. She would even take a single bowl of rice and spread it out over the entire day. She reserved any carb-heavy food for just Sundays. She also never went to sleep without locking the bedroom door because she was so paranoid of intruders. Maybe she had seen one too many scary movies. But everyone said she was a woman of habit. She really liked her routine. The police believe one part of Do-haeng's story at least. He did leave at 7 a.m. on Monday the 12th. And he did bring a garbage bag with him to the recycling center. The overnight security guard of the building had seen him leave at 7 a.m., but that guard's shift ended at 7:15, and then he switched with the second guard who was the one who saw the smoke. Based off the time that second guard saw smoke, the fire marshal determined with a reenactment that the fire ignition time was somewhere between 6:40 a.m. and 7:10 a.m., with a margin of error to 7:25 a.m. The fire itself was within the closed wardrobe, which meant it rapidly burned all of the oxygen inside and then began to smolder. Smoldering produces a large amount of smoke without large flames. The flames had extinguished on their own, and burning ash would have spread from the wardrobe. The smoke that the security guard noticed and eventually sprayed with the fire extinguisher was from the remaining burning wood of the closet. The clothes had likely completely burned within 3 minutes. This is a margin of time that allowed Do-haeng to have murdered his family and left the building at 7 a.m. Closing the closet doors would have been in an effort to delay the discovery of the fire. The employees at his clinic confirmed that he arrived at 8:05 a.m. to work, carrying a black briefcase, a dark duffel bag, and a paper shopping bag. On a typical day, Soo-hee would have left at 8 a.m. to take her daughter to her parents' house. She typically got to work at 8:30 a.m. When 8:10 started to come around, her mother got worried that perhaps they got into a traffic accident because she was never late. So she tried calling her daughter, but no one answered. At 9:10 a.m., she received a call from her daughter's dental clinic saying that they had been notified of a fire at her daughter's apartment. The dental assistant on the phone told her that a neighbor had called and told that there is a fire in the apartment, trying to see where Soo-hee was, but Soo-hee never came to work. One of her neighbors that she was friends with had called her at work, hoping to tell her, hey, your apartment is on fire or smoking or something. But the dental assistant was surprised because Soo-hee never came to work. They weren't sure what they should do, so they reached out to Soo-hee's mother, who they had the number of. The dental assistant also called Do-haeng at 9:30 a.m. to inform him of what had happened. None of them knew that Soo-hee or Hwa-young were found dead. When Do-haeng was told about the fire, he didn't act surprised at all. He just said, "Okay, I understand," and hung up. He called them back at 10 a.m. and told them that they should just tell patients they're not open for the day, and if he doesn't call them back, they should just leave at 6 p.m. and close the clinic. In the meantime, the neighbor ended up calling Do-haeng as well and asked him if his wife was lighting an indoor fogger smoke bomb for roaches. He calmly explained, "I don't think my wife would do that." Both the mother-in-law and dental assistant said that he was incredibly calm and never had a sense of urgency in his voice. Either he knew what truly had happened because he was the culprit, or he wasn't comprehending that there was a fire. If I heard that smoke was pouring out of my home, even if I couldn't leave work because I was a surgeon, I'd try calling someone to go check on my house and my family. If my family was unaccounted for, I'd be incredibly worried and probably be making a lot of calls panicked. He did try to leave work, but Soo-hee's mother was the first to arrive at the apartment building. She was a lot closer than Do-haeng was, whose new clinic was almost an hour away. The officers told her that she couldn't go inside, so she waited outside with the rest of the residents and onlookers. Do-haeng was able to arrive about 20 minutes later, and when he approached the police tape, he identified himself as the owner of the apartment. The officer was going to allow him inside, likely to inform him of the news of his family's deaths, but he refused and instead squatted down inside the building's entrance, crossed his arms around his legs, and put his head down. The mother-in-law said he looked spaced out and in shock. In his own testimony, he said that the police didn't allow him to enter, so that's why he stayed outside. But the officer clarified he was allowing him to go up to the 7th floor to talk to one of the investigating officers. After a short while, the police brought Do-haeng in for questioning because he was their prime suspect. Having known that Soo-hee had blood under her right hand's fingernails, they inspected his body for scratches or wounds. They found exactly what they were looking for. They found nail imprints on his right arm that were bleeding. These imprints on his upper arm were in the pattern as if someone had tightly grabbed him. It was enough to break skin. The prosecution later would believe these marks were from Soo-hee during their argument. The police photographed these and sent the pictures in as evidence. However, Do-haeng maintained that he was innocent and never hurt his wife. He states that these marks on his arm were actually a form of self-harm he had done while he was crouched outside. He had sat with his arms crossed, grabbing his own arm and squeezing tightly. While, yes, the nail direction would be similar, the medical examiner was able to determine that the nail imprints belonged to a right hand. Try it out. Try crossing your arms and squeezing both of your biceps tightly. You're grabbing your right arm with your left hand. There wasn't a way for him to grab his right arm with his right hand. Despite this, they weren't able to collect DNA from Soo-hee's hands due to the hot bath damaging the samples, so this evidence was not permitted. After this initial questioning, he was taken to the medical examiner's office with the mother-in-law to identify his family's remains. It was 3:30 a.m. when they went in. Outside of the office, he spoke to his mother-in-law. This was the first time he expressed any emotion, and the last time. For the rest of the trial, he was distant and dejected. He quietly asked if she had made any bean sprout soup for Soo-hee and Hwa-young to eat now. Then he started to cry while repeatedly telling her, "I'm sorry." A funeral was planned for later that day at 1:30 p.m. where he saw his brother-in-law and began to explain that the police thought that he had murdered Soo-hee and Hwa-young. He begged his brother-in-law to believe him and said he didn't know what happened, but he didn't do it. For the rest of the funeral, he didn't speak to anyone. Everyone was staring at him, waiting for something. They thought he just murdered his wife and child, their family member. I'm sure it was very uncomfortable for everyone. Do-haeng wasn't free, though. He was brought in again for questioning the next day. The police had discovered Soo-hee's former affair rather quickly after questioning the woman who worked at her dental clinic. The police searched her office and found a diary that she kept where she jotted down random thoughts she was having throughout the day. Some of them were confessions to her affair. In one of the notes, she'd written that she fantasized about Ugin when she was having sex with her husband. The only thing I can say is, yikes, why would you write that down? If Do-haeng had read this journal, that would be motive enough to kill his wife. That's all the police really needed. However, when the police brought up the affair, he acted fairly surprised that it was actually true. He had accused her of having an affair multiple times in front of her parents, her friends, and over the phone. But he said he'd never found out who she was having an affair with and the truth. But both of Soo-hee's parents stated that this wasn't true. While he came over to their house to have dinner, he had accused Soo-hee of having an affair with the interior designer, but she always denied the affair that she was actually having. Because he always believed she was having an affair, he always suspected that Hwa-young might not be his daughter. If he really believed that Hwa-young was the child of an affair his wife had, that would also be part of a motive for him to kill Hwa-young as well. The police began to uncover more motives that Do-haeng might have had to kill his family. His mother-in-law also was constantly fighting with him. Just earlier that year, they had taken a family trip to Guam, and throughout the entire family trip, his wife and mother-in-law escalated minor annoyances into large verbal fights. The mother-in-law admitted there was a lot of tension between Do-haeng and her family. If he wanted away from his family because he was clearly unhappy, that was his motive. The police also found another piece of evidence in the apartment. In a pair of pants thrown into a laundry basket, they found a piece of paper in the pocket. The note was a list of movie titles that he wanted to watch or he wanted to keep track of. When I told you that this case was similar to our last episode, but just jumbled around, I was not joking. On this list was the 1992 film Single White Female. Spoilers ahead. This film plot follows Allie, a woman whose fiancé cheats on her with his ex-wife. She deals with a new roommate that steals her identity and tries to seduce her fiancé. The impersonator goes crazy and murders the fiancé as well as a neighbor and tries to frame it on Allie. She puts one of the men in the bathtub and burns their clothes to destroy evidence. I have not seen this film, so if you have, please let me know if you actually think it is similar to this case. There are obviously some similarities from the plot summary that I read, but it's also quite a stretch. Just as in our previous episode, the film The Culprit was a little bit of a stretch to compare to. Regardless, the list of films included all murder flicks. 1 or 2 involved spousal murder. It seemed like he really just liked horror and mystery films, because those were the only movies he rented from video rental stores. Do-haeng told the officer he couldn't recall seeing this particular movie, but the officers presented him with receipts that they'd collected from the video rental stores. He had rented this movie in February the previous year and again in October. The second time, he'd kept the film out past the due date and needed to pay a late fee. Do-haeng continued to deny renting the film. If you're innocent, why lie about this? It was easy to prove he had rented it multiple times. And it was clear he'd watched it. He'd even written the film's name down on a recent note that he kept in his pants pocket. But there was such a lack of hard evidence in this case. The murder weapons, namely the curtain string and thin string used to strangle the two, were missing. The police never found these, and they couldn't even be sure that the curtain string was what was used. But it did fit the right size. There were no threads left behind to be collected off of their bodies. Anything from the bedroom was too badly singed from the heat to be analyzed. The medical examiner was able to determine, however, that the string used to strangle Hwa-young was similar to a surgical thread. Whatever string was used was incredibly sturdy and very thin, like floss. Surgical thread would be something Do-haeng had a lot of access to. Hwa-young was murdered 30 minutes after Soo-hee as well. The killer had time to contemplate how they would kill Hwa-young, or if they would kill her at all. Hwa-young was also not heard crying or screaming during this time. If someone had invaded the home, a 2-year-old would probably be screaming or crying. But if her father was there, and if Do-haeng had killed Soo-hee behind the closed bedroom door, and then come to kill her, she would be none the wiser. To me, it seems that Do-haeng would have thought about staging the scene to appear like Soo-hee was sexually assaulted and murdered by an invader. But then why use surgical thread that would clearly be tied back to himself? The surgical thread was both evidence that pointed to Do-haeng being the killer, and also, for me, pointed towards someone else being the killer. If it was someone else, then they were trying to cover up their crimes and make it appear as if Do-haeng was the killer. Do-haeng continued to maintain his innocence, and his defense attorney had some really strong arguments. First, the couple had 5 sets of keys to their apartment. 4 sets of keys were accounted for, but the 5th set was missing from the kitchen drawer. The police were unable to locate this set of keys, and Do-haeng already had his set, Soo-hee had hers in her purse, and the mother-in-law had hers. They had a fourth set in a jar in their house. This set might have just gone missing, or someone lost their keys at some point and switched them out, but it could also be whoever killed Soo-hee and Hwa-young had taken the keys from the apartment and come back to hurt the family. That means Ugil, the man she had an affair with, anyone in their family, or a family friend could be a culprit. They wanted to determine Do-haeng's guilt by submitting him to a lie detector test. The lie detector tests were administered on the 7th and 13th of July, a month after the incident. Do-haeng consented to the tests because he said they would prove his innocence. A third test was conducted, however, the sister-in-law walked in on the third test, which made the results not permitted to be used. The conductor of the test asked questions in various orders, in different wordings, and in ways that only a truly innocent person would be able to maintain their story. They're looking specifically for information that's not revealed through the media or the person trying to correct information the officer gets intentionally wrong. It's essentially investigative manipulation to try to get you to trip up on your lies. Watching a real lie detector test be conducted is incredibly interesting how they are able to get people to reveal their secrets. When he was presented with information about the murder scene, times of the murders, and the timeline of the murders, Do-haeng had significant emotional responses, which was contrary to how collected he had been throughout the entire investigation. His defense attorney argued that these results were due to the police's use of leading questions and use of graphic photographs of his deceased family. Anyone would have panic responses to these. They argued that the police had already made up their mind that he was guilty before the trial, and they were cherry-picking the case to only select what made Do-haeng appear to be the culprit. Regardless, the lie detector test was admitted as evidence in the first trial, but later was disallowed. The prosecution proposed that this is what truly happened on the evening of June 11th, 1995. Do-haeng returned home and ate dinner with his family. Then, Soo-hee put their daughter to bed. Soo-hee talked to her sister on the phone around 9:30 p.m. They had a conversation that turned into an argument with Do-haeng after Soo-hee expressed her desire to have her sister work at Do-haeng's new clinic. As the argument escalated, it is believed that Do-haeng confronted Soo-hee about various issues in their marriage, including allegations of infidelity and financial stress. In a moment of rage, he allegedly grabbed the curtain rope and strangled her. Afterward, consumed by doubt about Hwa-young's paternity, he made the decision to kill his daughter as well. He grabbed surgical thread from his work bag and strangled her. Following the murders, Do-haeng placed both bodies in the bathtub and attempted to cover up the crime by setting fire to clothes in the wardrobe. He closed the wardrobe doors to delay discovery. He then left for work at 7 a.m., establishing an alibi for himself. Despite the fact that the prosecution's case paints a really chilling picture of a man whose emotional turmoil turned him against his family, it just wasn't enough to prove his guilt. Bringing all of the evidence to court, on February 23, 1996, Dr. Lee Do-haeng was sentenced to death in the first trial, but on June 26, 1996, he was acquitted due to insufficient evidence in the second trial. This sent the public into a fury, who started calling this the Korean OJ Simpson Trial. They felt they knew Do-haeng was guilty, but he wasn't found guilty. On November 13, 1998, the Supreme Court remanded the case for retrial with a guilty verdict, but February 17, 2001, the High Court declared him not guilty again. And then on February 26, 2003, the Supreme Court finally declared him not guilty. In summary, the verdict read that the evidence against the defendant failed to meet the standard of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Key factors, including a lack of clear motive, uncertainty about the time of death, and the likelihood that the fire started after the defendant left for work. Furthermore, while the defendant's inconsistent statements may raise question, they do not directly indicate guilt. Favorable evidence, such as the deceased's contact lenses and herbal medicine packets, as well as the potential involvement of a third party, suggest reasonable doubt. Consequently, the indirect evidence presented does not substantiate the indictment. And that is the end of Do-haeng's story. He never saw jail time, Regardless if Do-haeng is the killer or not, the killer failed to see justice. I wonder if you were as annoyed by this case as I was. As I researched this case, I thought I was certain that Do-haeng was the killer, but I can't truly be sure. I also had my doubts. As always, thank you for listening. Join us on Discord for free movie nights. Find my sources on Patreon. Quarterly Sticker Club is also on Patreon. You can follow the show wherever you listen from, and I truly appreciate if you give me a good rating. Ratings are what help the show be recommended. Thank you to my patrons, Vix Mac, Lala, William White, G1 Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Tafoya, Adriana, Pip, Dade512, Lisa, Veronica, Olive, Caitlin, Sharon Evans, Nicey, Breaker O'Day, Kitten Who, and Ostabach. Tama ito payo. See you next time.